From the war in Ukraine to the growing conflict in Israel, the battlefield is constantly changing. New weapons continue to roll off the assembly line, and politics becomes more convoluted every day. In the past, NATO has been a champion of peace, unity, and democracy worldwide. Emerging victorious from the Cold War, its role has shifted, with some people questioning its place on the world stage. Do NATO's weaknesses outweigh its strengths? Let's talk about it. But we need to start with a little context first. Both of the world wars were destructive on an almost biblical level, and out of the ashes, people were left with a feeling of never again. But post-World War II, the world's political situation was a little complicated. The Soviet Union, once a friend to the Western powers and a crucial ally in defeating Nazi Germany, now found themselves at odds over who controlled what in Europe. As things spiraled out of control and tensions escalated, it became more apparent to the US, UK, and other Western countries that something needed to be done to ensure their hard-won peace continued. And thus, NATO was founded. Established in 1949 with the hope of preserving peace in Europe, it aimed to deter the Soviet threat that loomed over the land. It's designed to operate primarily as a defensive alliance. If an outside party attacked any of the member nations, then all of the nations of NATO would respond in force. Paradoxically, nothing guarantees peace quite like the promise of extreme violence. But how big of a guarantee was this? Since 1949, NATO has seen its membership grow to 31 countries around Europe and 40 additional partner countries globally. While not full members, the partner countries and NATO work together to achieve shared goals of peace and prosperity. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, its role changed significantly. NATO forces undertook significant combat operations for the first time in the Bosnian War in the mid-90s, the Kosovo War in the late 90s, and continued to expand its capabilities with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. After the September 11th attacks, something big happened. Article 5 of the NATO Charter was invoked for the first time and only time in the organization's history. This called on all members of the alliance to consider the attack on the United States as an attack on all of them. This acceleration in military operations did not slow down after that, and NATO found itself even further involved in conflicts throughout the Middle East. But why is NATO's involvement or non-involvement in these and similar conflicts so crucial? What exactly are its main strengths? First and foremost, NATO's greatest asset, and the main idea behind its founding, is deterrence and defense through strength in unity. All for one and one for all, as the saying goes. The Soviet Union had emerged from World War II as a military and industrial juggernaut. Their nuclear arms program, armed forces, and the military-industrial complex on the home front had turned it from a struggling country with strange political ideas to a heavyweight fighter who was ready to square up with the best the US had to offer. The idea of strength through unity worked well enough to keep Soviet tanks from rolling through West Germany, extinguish the always resurgent flames of nationalism, and avoid Europe becoming a nuclear wasteland all throughout the Cold War. As NATO expanded to countries in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and even as far east as Turkey, untold number of regional conflicts were avoided and peace largely reigned. No one dared attack a member of NATO because if they did, they knew they'd have American-made fiery precision burning their house down faster than thought possible. Say what you will about the US, but when it comes to making weapons, it really is second to none. Possessing some of the finest weaponry in the world and also working together as a unified team spells power. In Afghanistan, for instance, the NATO forces were made up of troops from every member nation, with the overall commander position being occupied by a revolving door of generals from multiple nations. With a unified command structure for all the NATO forces involved, their mission was clear and concise, ready to strike as a cohesive unit. All of this cohesion has many benefits as the world continues to evolve and the political and military landscape shifts. With new technology and new weapons always being produced, NATO stands ready to adapt to new threats. Protection against cyber attacks, for example, is a key part of NATO's defense and deterrence plan and is becoming increasingly vital. Cooperative security is absolutely crucial here, as nations need to work together to mitigate the ever-changing and complex cyber attacks that are being employed. This idea goes beyond cybersecurity and really applies to all facets of NATO's defense. Without coordinated efforts and training, the alliance would be extremely vulnerable to threats. But for all of its highbrow ideals and extravagant plans, NATO has some glaring weaknesses that could prove disastrous if a few things don't go their way. As the list of NATO members grows longer and many smaller Eastern European countries are brought into the fold, you would think that this means an even more secure peace, but that might not necessarily be the case. As NATO inches further eastward, what has really happened is it has backed the Russian bear into a corner, the results of which might doom the world. But before we get into that, let's take a quick trip back to the 90s. A great time for grunge and low-waisted pants, not so much for anyone living in post-Soviet Union Russia, where political and economic turmoil left the country like a ship without a rudder. The breakup of the Soviet Union left a lot of questions to be answered about the borders of Eastern Europe and the expansion of NATO. During negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1990, the US made assurances to their Russian counterparts that with the reunification of Europe, NATO would not expand its membership to Moscow's doorstep. Both sides came away satisfied with the progress they had made and called it a day. Like any good politician, the US and NATO immediately went back on their word and began the process of expanding eastward. As you might have guessed, this enraged Moscow, who claimed that NATO had broken its agreement and done exactly the opposite of what it had promised. NATO simply shrugged and said we didn't have anything in writing, so get over it. Russia during the 90s and 2000s was very vulnerable, and they were still picking up the pieces of their broken empire, so they were in no place to put up too much of an argument. But they never forgot. As each US president since 1990 has advanced NATO's boundaries eastward, tensions have skyrocketed and finally exploded with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Potential NATO expansion into Ukraine is one of Putin's key justifications for starting the war. In March of 2022, President Joe Biden vowed to defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of its collective power. But what if certain NATO members break formation and want to attempt negotiation rather than fight? All it really takes is instability of some kind to take hold in a few countries for Putin to gamble that the reward outweighs the risk, and that's exactly what NATO has been afraid of. With the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, NATO has been paralyzed by fear of antagonizing Putin and has, whenever possible, tried to steer clear of his way. Putin knew the advantage he had and acted accordingly. Several countries, including Germany and Turkey, have significant economic relations with Russia, and this leverage caused them to hesitate and not react decisively as a cohesive group. Up until the launching of the invasion of Ukraine, Germany was one of Russia's biggest trading partners on the continent, and even imported 50 to 70% of its natural gas from them. Turkey also benefited greatly from their trade with Russia, with the trade volume between the two countries being worth around $26 billion in 2019. Even with the invasion of Ukraine, this deep-seated division over how to deal with Russian aggression reared its ugly head. No significant NATO aid was delivered to Ukraine before the invasion, and there was even hesitation in the immediate aftermath. If NATO had taken preemptive action and cooperated with each other, there is a chance Ukraine could have struck a decisive blow early on, but sadly we'll never know. Most NATO members don't exactly have the strongest militaries, so if the alliance was in jeopardy, some countries, the Baltic ones especially, would be cannon fodder for the Russian war machine. Knowing full well that they would be on the front line, would countries like Latvia or Lithuania stand up and fight, or just roll over and let Russia walk on in? American firepower is a hell of a deterrent, but a lot could happen before the cavalry could ride to the rescue. No one could say for certain what will happen until they hear those T-90s rumbling in the distance. Even Europe's supposed military superpowers, the UK, France, and Germany, have let their militaries atrophy ever since the Cold War, with a brief resurgence with their involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, but then right back to letting them waste away. Their troop numbers and available resources hardly leave them able to effectively fight a ground war against a major military power anytime soon. The British military, for instance, is at its smallest size since they were fighting Napoleon with flintstock muskets and swords. Yep, you heard that right. Overextending themselves into unstable territory is a massive risk for NATO, as the chance of getting pulled into armed conflict continues to climb. At the end of the day, troop and resource commitment by NATO members is voluntary, so if Estonia or the Czech Republic, for example, decides not to honor the agreement, it may have a domino effect, leaving the US holding the bag, even more than it already is. That leads us to another massive weakness in NATO's defense plan. As it currently stands, the United States covers about 2/3 of NATO defense spending. 2/3. For reference, NATO defense spending in 2022 totaled around $1 trillion. Two-thirds of that is roughly $660 billion. Having two-thirds of your eggs in one metaphorical basket is pretty much never a good idea. What if something happened and the US could no longer contribute as much money and resources to the NATO defense budget? As unlikely as it seems for the US to stop producing outrageous amounts of weapons, or for the economy to take a nosedive, crazier things have happened. In 2006, the NATO defense ministers agreed that 2% of each country's GDP should be put towards collective defense spending. Year after year, most of the countries fall laughably short. In 2022, only the US, Estonia, Greece, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and the United Kingdom hit the mark. So it's safe to say that without US assistance, NATO would be about as effective as the Postal Service would be if they had to go back to using horses. The over-reliance on US manpower and resources for protection could seriously come back to haunt NATO. Controlling a large majority of the defense budget gives them a tremendous amount of leverage to theoretically direct NATO where they want it to go. The US is currently the majority supplier of arms and ammunition to Ukraine. As of September 2023, over $46 billion has been sent to Ukraine in the shape of weapons, ammunition, logistical and security training, support equipment, and loans to go and buy more stuff. The aid is proving to be crucial to the Ukrainian resistance, as they doggedly defend every trench line and outpost against the Russian behemoth. Its weapons like the Javelin and Stinger missiles are giving the Ukrainians an edge against the Russians. These mobile weapon systems allow soldiers to pick off Russian armor and aircraft and retreat into the trees unseen. Seems like the Russians learned nothing from their time in Afghanistan. Now, while most would probably agree that helping Ukraine is a positive thing, you have to look at the balance of aid being given. The amount of US aid being given is over double that of the closest European powers, that being Germany and the UK. The fact of the matter is the US is better equipped and more proficient at producing weapons and other war supplies than the rest of NATO because they have been at war for the past 20 years. It's not that Germany, Italy, or the UK don't have assault rifles and tanks. They do have lots of them, but only enough of them to supply their own armies. That's why Ukraine did not receive its shipment of Leopard tanks from Germany until over a year into the invasion. They simply did not have enough to spare. With the NATO scales so heavily tilted in the US's favor, you have to question if this alliance is actually fair and equal as it claims to be, or do the other NATO members go along with whatever the US wants just to maintain the status quo? While the US certainly profits tremendously from trading with a peaceful Europe, war has always proven to be a huge moneymaker for the ones who produce the weapons. Further militarization of Europe only benefits the US. This leverage that the US holds over NATO further cements American influence in Europe, and that influence is going to keep growing as long as the balance of power remains that way. In 2020, the US and Poland signed an agreement that allowed 10,000 US troops to be stationed on Polish soil, acting as a boots-on-the-ground check to Russian aggression in the region. The US military is also in the process of opening some bases in Romania, hoping to extend NATO naval reach to the Black Sea. The US has taken a similar approach to combating the threat posed by China, with multiple bases around the Pacific. These bases in the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, etc., give the US the ability to counter a Chinese attack and provide logistical support at incredible speeds. With this much of a presence and a tremendous amount of influence in the region, NATO better hope and pray that the US remains peaceful and on the defensive. Another potential problem for NATO that has been gaining traction in recent years is that of the changes in public opinion. Now, while most citizens in NATO countries have a positive opinion of the alliance, there is a slightly growing dissent amongst Americans as to the effectiveness and relevance of NATO. This goes back to the whole "don't keep two-thirds of your eggs in a metaphorical basket" thing. If the US was to reduce its support for NATO and/or Ukraine, the consequences could spell disaster for Europe and maybe even the world. As unlikely as this is, politics is an unpredictable game. NATO's extreme reliance on American funding and support leaves them vulnerable to a variety of problems that could arise. This is an issue that will be discussed at length in every presidential election to come and will grow in the minds of its citizens as the war in Ukraine deepens. The most dangerous threat to NATO, however, might come from inside its own alliance. Ever since Turkish President Erdogan has been in office, Turkey has acted essentially in its own self-interest, with little regard for how its actions affect the rest of NATO. Always the political wild card, Turkey knows how to keep things interesting. Turkey joined NATO during the height of the Cold War in 1952, hoping for protection from a potential Soviet invasion across the Straits of the Dardanelles. Turkey had been applying for NATO membership for years and was only accepted when the US and other NATO members realized the defensive value they would have in the event of Soviet aggression. Since Turkey gained membership, it's proved itself to be a valuable member of the alliance, as they possess the second largest military behind the United States and possess multiple important military bases, including the Incirlik and Konya air bases. From an economic perspective, Turkey has the potential to be a major player on the world stage. It's the 19th largest economy in the world and has a GDP of $906 billion. Employing ambitious reforms from 2006 to 2017, Turkey saw income rates rise and widespread poverty reduction. While economic growth has stalled as of late, the potential is still there. The area around the Sea of Marmara is also an extremely valuable resource for Turkey, NATO, and the world. This area is rich in agricultural land and is also home to some of the most profitable and important trade routes in the world. It's very clear why, from both a military and economic perspective, Turkey is such a valuable member of the alliance. But that doesn't mean its membership has all been smooth sailing. With such a wide variety of countries in NATO, it's always possible that one of them could step out of line and do something to strain the unity of the alliance. Turkey continues to find itself in regional conflicts with its neighbors or groups close to the region. The longest-running conflict it's still fighting is without a doubt with the Kurdish people. For reference, the Kurds are an ethnic group who reside in parts of Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, and their population numbers around 30 to 40 million. They've been fighting this bloody war with Turkey since 1978, and no end is in sight. This conflict especially complicates things for Turkey, as killing Kurds will only alienate them from the United States. The Kurds and the US have had a relationship going back decades now, and the Kurds have served as an important partner for US interests in the region, most recently in the fight against ISIS. In 2017, the UN expressed concern about the Turkish treatment of Kurds, but nothing was actually done about it. In the same year, the US attempted to supply Kurdish forces with weapons, but Turkey objected, claiming that doing so violated NATO rules. Turkey claims that the Kurds are nothing more than terrorists and want to wipe them out, but the US claims that the Kurds have been their partners for years and are not terrorists. So while men in suits debate this and make eloquent arguments in fancy rooms, the brutal truth is that people on the ground are going to keep getting killed until NATO can figure out what side of the fence it's on. Besides Turkey's ongoing saber-rattling with the Kurds, they continue to be problematic neighbors for the rest of the Middle East and Europe. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Turkey unequivocally supported Ukraine and pledged to support them militarily for the duration of the war. This show of unity with the rest of NATO was not out of the goodness of their heart, but a strategic one. They could not allow Russia to control any more of the Black Sea and shift the balance of power in the region. While not a surprising move, it might be worth keeping an eye on Turkey throughout the duration of the conflict. Another area in which Turkey is becoming increasingly problematic for NATO is the fact that they have backslid from a budding democracy to an increasingly authoritarian regime under President Erdogan. He continues to crush any opposition to his rule and consolidate his power, including making changes to Turkey's parliamentary system to benefit him and his party. Turkey has also suppressed freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and removed the checks and balances that are a staple of true democracies. They have even gone as far as jailing political opponents, journalists, and anyone who is in favor of dissent. This regression has of course harmed the citizens of Turkey the most, as state institutions are eroded and the economy loses momentum. The final nail in the democratic coffin seemingly occurred with their last election in May of 2023, where President Erdogan was re-elected in what almost certainly were not free or fair elections. Going more toward authoritarianism is extremely troubling to NATO, as this goes against one of the pillars of the alliance, that being the promotion of democracy, a value that is supposed to be shared by all members of NATO. So as Turkey becomes more authoritarian, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing down, its relationship with its NATO allies is becoming increasingly strained. For all the headaches they cause their allies, Turkey remains an important part of NATO. Their regional and strategic importance has allowed them to get away with a lot, but at some point will NATO say enough is enough? As Turkey continues to play fast and loose with its foreign policy and continues to act in its own interest, there may come a point where NATO believes their membership cannot be justified anymore. The usual tactic they employ is waiting out problematic leaders, and using a combination of political and economic pressure to effect change, but it might not be enough. As it currently stands, there is no mechanism for suspension or expulsion from NATO. However, that does not mean that it theoretically couldn't happen. If Turkey was to take a step too far, NATO could find them in material breach of the treaty and find creative ways to remove them. This is unlikely, as Turkey would have to do something rather extreme, but it's technically possible. Only time will tell, but it looks like as of the production of this video, that Turkey isn't moving in the right direction. Looking at NATO as a whole, there are enough strengths and weaknesses to keep political analysts and the talking heads on TV busy until the end of time. NATO has historically proven that they have been a force for good and have promoted peace and democracy throughout the world. It's not out of line to say that the unity of NATO and its deterrence of the Soviet Union probably helped save the world from nuclear annihilation through mutually assured destruction. Not too shabby. After the resounding victory in the Cold War and the dawn of a new era for NATO, they have adapted to new threats and worked, for the most part, as a cohesive team, ready to face new military, technological, and humanitarian challenges head-on. The world never sits still, and the ever-changing political landscape is seemingly more complicated than ever. NATO's unity and values are going to be continually put to the test as new crises and conflicts arise. Will they close ranks and de-escalate things, or will division and tensions allow the alliance to be dragged into wars that could be their undoing? Overextension of the alliance into unstable countries is certainly a risk, as more members of NATO means more potential for conflict to arise. Remember the phrase all for one and one for all. Following its current trend, it also means that the United States is paying the defense bill for a growing list of countries. While this is great for the Americans' weapons manufacturing industry, this over-reliance on American bombs and bullets could prove disastrous if public opinion shifts or some once-in-a-lifetime economic crisis unfolds. However unlikely, it's worth considering. American influence in Europe has grown exponentially since the creation of NATO, and it doesn't seem like it will stop anytime soon. The US continues to build military bases and station troops in Europe, while also being the chief source of all things weapon-related. This gives the US a tremendous amount of influence and leverage over the other members of the alliance. This amount of power requires extremely careful handling going forward. You might want to dig a little deeper when thinking about who to vote for in the next election, my American friends. NATO has its fair share of issues, but debatably the biggest one comes from Turkey. Once a democracy, they have become an authoritative regime that imprisons political opponents and squashes free speech. It continues to act in its own self-interest and stoke the flames of regional conflicts with neighbors. Its involvement in Syria, Libya, and the ongoing campaign against the Kurdish people has only served to create more division in NATO and make people question the true nature of the alliance. As problematic as they are, Turkey remains a powerful ally that sits at the crossroads of the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, and likely won't be going anywhere in the near future. All in all, NATO has its strengths and weaknesses like any organization. Historically, it's carried the torch for the betterment of humanity, but as the world continues to evolve and situations change, will it still be needed? Let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts.